Good evening and welcome to this last sixth of this year's Tuohy lectures on the challenge of peace and reconciliation for Christian self-understanding. Before I make some announcements, I want to take this opportunity for us all to thank Professor William Campbell for these lectures. They have been marvelous, probing particularly of Paul's contribution to our self-understanding. And just another little thing to look ahead. Next fall, we will have another series of Tuohy lectures, and this will be on Christians and Muslims in dialogue, self and understanding. So just kind of put that in the back of your mind. This evening's lecture on building the future, the correlation of community and diversity, and you should have a handout about that. Those of you who were not here last week might want to pick up the fifth lecture handout on reconciliation and Christian responsibility. There are some down here because I think Professor Campbell is going to have a bit of a recap of that for us as he goes into this evening's lecture. So let's welcome again Professor William Campbell.
Now, it's a pleasure to see, I was going to say old faces, but familiar faces in the audience. One of the things that you wonder when the weather's very bad, will anybody come? And after a couple of nights, I realized, yes, there'll be at least a dozen who are here nearly every night, and at least there'll be somebody to talk to. Now, for the students who weren't able to come last week because of the reading week, I have left the handout for last week, and we'll recap a little bit at the beginning of this. So you should have a summary or a handout for Lecture 6 and a handout for Lecture 5. So there are some copies at the front or back, so if you want to get those, feel free to do so. Before I start, I should say that in the midst of the terrible situation in Japan, we must not forget this, and instead of commenting upon it, just to say that in a world such as this, which is a tough and serious world, there is no place for bigotry and prejudice and harming the neighbour. There's enough for us to do to help each other, that we do not need to fight and make lives worse than they actually are. Our topic then for last week was Christian responsibility, social responsibility, and I begin briefly on that. But our topic is building the future, the correlation of commonality and diversity. Reconciliation comes from Old French, re plus the Latin conciliare, to unite, hence reunite what is separated. I think it is by far the best and most effective description of Christian mission today. In disputes with the Corinthian community, Paul called upon them to reconcile themselves to God, who in Christ was acting to reconcile the world to himself. Paul also called on the Corinthians to be reconciled to him and to join him in his mission, which he described as the ministry of reconciliation. Reconciliation has not been central in Christian theology as it ought to have been. It is a metaphor describing the at-one-ment, how God and man have become one through Christ in Christian theology. This image makes Christians into ambassadors of Christ, seeking to bring reconciliation and peace to the world. This is not about the reconciliation of individuals, but of groups and of nations. Individuals by themselves cannot change society. It takes groups, large groups working together, politically and socially, to force the civic authorities and the government to listen to moral perspectives rather than to financiers, big business, and loud-mouthed extremists. The gospel is not only about individuals, but about the whole of society, about the whole of the world. When Paul uses the image of reconciliation, it comes from Isaiah chapter 65. This is where we find the Hebrew concept of shalom, universal peace and righteousness. Here the prophet tells of the return of the exiled people of Israel from Babylonian captivity with much rejoicing. So it is about God's people being saved from captivity, their restoration, and the parallel restoration of universal peace and harmony, with the Gentiles being blessed as a result of Israel's deliverance. Paul holds this same theology, not just about the salvation of individuals in Christ, but about the salvation of Israel and the reconciliation of the world. So the church's mission is one of a ministry of reconciliation addressed to the world. This implies the presence of hostility, and it might seem that my arguments in these lectures about our right to retain our identity in Christ could be wrongly interpreted as allowing ethnic apartheid or ethnic cleansing, not if we see our task as called to reconciliation. Reconciliation does presuppose hostility arising from difference, but it simultaneously demands its demise. You cannot claim a Christ identity and maintain hostility against those who are different. But evangelical Protestantism in the United Kingdom and the USA has disintegrated into innumerable splinter groups of a sectarian nature. So often these close ranks against those not their members and regard all those outside as opponents, thus subdividing the whole of society and weakening Christian status and impact in the process. Far from being conciliatory, some Christians are often aggressive and conflictual in attitude. A typical feature of human activity is that when people act as members of groups, they tend to take sides, stressing the differences that constitute each group, rather than what all the groups hold in common. This has got to change, because these small Christian groups are thus agents of animosity, of aggression and division, rather than agents of conciliation and peace. Blessed are the peacemakers, said Jesus. Where are they among our splintered Protestant underground? If God is working to reconcile the world unto himself, it is our obligation to assist him in this process. Romans 5, chapter 1 to 2 can be read something in this summary. Since we have obtained access to this grace, we have peace, interpreted as peace with God. So all is well with our soul. But this verse can be better read. Since we are justified by faith and have obtained access into this grace, let us maintain peace. It's not a matter of having peace and then doing what you like with it. It's a matter of having not just peace with God, but maintaining peace in society as well. In most of this series of lectures, I've been stressing the diversity of the created world, maintaining that God, the Creator, God of the Hebrew Bible, made everything. He made the creation one humanity, but diverse in so many respects. He made a covenant with the whole of this humanity prior to making the covenant with Abraham, on which Jewish and Christian religions rely. Diversity in creed, color, and culture was either an unfortunate mistake in this world, or, as I would prefer to claim, divinely intended. What sort of arrogant person is going to claim that the greater part of the creation that God has made is a mistake? Not a very good creator to come out with that result. Of course, the other side of the biblical narrative is that humanity sinned and is imperfect, not reaching the goals its creator intended. But nevertheless, the image of the one who created us has not been completely obliterated. Human beings still reflect the image of God, even in their imperfection. John Calvin, a famous Geneva theologian at the Reformation, insisted on describing this imperfection of human beings as total depravity. By this he meant that it was not just our bodies that were sinful, but our mind was not perfect as well. Now remember, this is at the time of the Reformation, and Calvin is trying to score points against his opponents. So if they say that you've got a good mind and you can make good choices, Calvin said, not at all. Your mind's just as sinful as the rest of you. And so that means that God has to do everything rather than man thinking and choosing by himself. But however Calvin formulated this, there can be no suggestion that the image of God only resides in perfect human beings. This is certainly not biblical doctrine. The words of Jesus exemplify what I am asserting. If you then, being sinful, know how to give good things to your children, how much more will your heavenly Father give good things to those that ask him? Jesus presumed parents knew how to give good things to their children, even if they were sinful. So we are not pessimistic about human potential, despite human weakness, and hence our human culture, reflecting the choices that millions of parents gifted to their children, is not simply a total perversion or of no positive value for God's people. So we are then able to argue that the commonality of human culture is something in which all of us are involved and which all of us can utilize to promote the good of everyone. In my previous lectures, I have maintained that in the earliest Christianity reflected in Paul's letters, there was no argument that Jews should give up their Jewish identity on becoming followers of Jesus Christ. In its earliest days, not only its leader, but also all of his followers were of Jewish origin. So there could be no question of relinquishing their Jewish identity. When non-Jewish people, whom the New Testament calls people of the nations, or Gentiles, joined the Christ movement, Paul argued fiercely that they also should retain their identity as Gentiles and should not be required to become Jews. Otherwise, God would be the God of Jews only, something that Jews themselves never claimed. But more than a century later, when the temple at Jerusalem had been destroyed by the Romans in 66 to 73 CE, and then after a second Jewish revolt 60 years later, in the Bar Kokhba revolt, 132 to 135 CE, the time of the Emperor Hadrian, when Jews were then forced to leave Jerusalem and other anti-Jews were formulated, it became easier for the Christ movement to think of itself as a replacement for Judaism. By this time, there were many assemblies of Christ followers, some mainly Jewish, others mainly Gentile, in most of the major cities of the Roman Empire. And these scattered groups began to think of themselves as one entity, no longer as the varied assemblies of Christ, but now as the Church of Christ Universal. Having reached this overview of their own identity, it was then easy to claim that since Israel's temple had been destroyed and the people of Israel dispersed from Jerusalem, the church could properly designate itself as the new Israel, something that first became explicit around 160 CE. In differing forms, this view of the church in Israel began to take shape, reaching its strongest emphasis when the Emperor Constantine made Christianity the religion of the empire in the early part of the 4th century. From this time on, Jewish identity and Christian identity began to be perceived as an opposition, despite their shared heritage. The tendency was for the church to take over the inheritance of Judaism by claiming to be the rightful heir to this. So Israel's scriptures become part of the Christian Bible and began to be perceived as the Old Testament instead of the Hebrew Bible. In New Testament times, when Jesus and Paul were active, there was one Hebrew Bible and a Greek translation of this used by everyone in the Christ movement as well as by Jews. But when Paul's letters and the 4 Gospels began to be put together with other Christian writings at the end of the 1st century, a distinction had to be made between the Hebrew scriptures and the new writings now being also perceived as scripture. And so eventually, after some time, the description Old and New Testament began to develop. The church begins to think of itself as a new Israel with both the Old and the New Scriptures, thus having the potential to claim that they had displaced God's people Israel. So the church, though still theoretically a church formed from both Jews and Gentiles, opposed Judaism and Jewish culture, as already noted, in opposition to the identity of the church. by councils, creeds, and legislation, the church sought to make the whole of society conform to perceived Christian patterns. But this was not the introduction of an entirely new ethos, as if Christian culture were a revelation from above. It was rather a development of normal Greco-Roman culture as it varied throughout the Roman Empire. Some Jewish Christian assemblies continued to exist for the next 2 centuries or more, but were marginalized or persecuted to make them conform. What we want you to note from this is that Christianity built first on Jewish traditions and then became more Greek in its development as a mainly Gentile church, making its home in Greek and Roman culture and reflecting to a great extent the imperial pattern of conformity as far as possible through the regions where it developed, particularly in the west of the Roman Empire. In the east, more diversity was normal, and liturgy in the local language was permitted, something that would eventually lead to disunity in the church. So although there was a great drive towards conformity in the church, the same patterns did not operate universally, and unity with diversity was the pattern rather than sameness. Thus, the history of the church in Western culture is a history of gradual development from a Greco-Roman base. What is different at the moment is that the influx in the last several hundred years of people who did not share this culture or history seems to be threatening to destroy what Christianity has developed. But as we have already noted, the culture in which Christianity first developed was already in existence, the product of the cultures of Israel, of Greece, and of Rome. Christianity was developed within this and transformed it in many respects, but could never claim to have created it from scratch, as it were. What we are claiming here is that there are many human cultures, and these are very diverse, but that there is no uniquely Christian culture, only cultures in which Christianity plays at most a dominant role, as in the UK and the USA. Thus it could be argued Confucian ethics are a foundational factor in Korean Christianity. There is no specific Korean Christian culture without some aspects of Confucianism. What this means for us today is that Western culture, though having strong Christian foundations, is not uniquely Christian, but much wider than this. It is a broad enough base to support diverse religious outlooks and patterns of life. So there is no point in arguing that a small number of Muslim migrants in and of itself will change our contemporary societies beyond recognition. So instead of emphasizing how and where we differ from these, it is possible instead to emphasize what we have in common. This is not a reversal of my previous lectures on diversity. It is building upon them. Conventional wisdom suggests that we should play down differences in our citizens so as eventually to make them all the same and thus avoid cultural conflict. But this is to reverse the process that I am maintaining. What I have insisted upon is that it is only when people are secure in their own identity that they will be able to associate with others who are different without feeling threatened or insecure. If we attack people who are different, as minorities, they already feel vulnerable, and our aggressive behavior increases this insecurity, making them more separatist and uncooperative. The attempt to assimilate the stranger and to make them identical with us is a fear of the unknown and an unwillingness to acknowledge that real difference already exists, and it will not go away by opposing it. When groups are threatened, they no longer admit differences within themselves, but put up a united front against perceived opposition. And this hardens their group identity, thus making society even more fragmented than it is already. If one really believed that the way to a peaceful society is the overcoming of difference and the making of everyone conform and be the same, which I entirely oppose, I still maintain that a policy of recognizing and affirming people in their difference is the best way forward, whatever its outcome. By alienating minorities, we are in fact strengthening them in their resistance to domination by the wider society, and thus preventing their full growth and full participation. Nor do minorities have the power to change the majority culture. These are the scandalmongers. These are the people who promote suspicion and prejudice and pretend that a small group of people will change a huge nation. Why do we allow such nonsense to pass uncriticized? Minorities have not the power to change the majority culture. If there are real problems, the power to change lies with the majority who make the laws and maintain that dominant culture. We must get things in perspective and not allow people to be scaremongers, to frighten society, to share their prejudices. The Jews were far from strangers in the Greco-Roman world of their time. Some had been transported from Judea, their recognized homeland. Jews were universally recognized as belonging to Judea and could rightly be termed Judeans even if they no longer actually lived there. Judea was poor in the period of Christian origins, but the Mediterranean cities were flourishing. So Jews also chose to follow the major trade routes and lived happily most of the time with their Greek and Roman neighbors. They did not fully assimilate, but acquired an ability to participate enough to be part of the wider society without being completely assimilated into it. They became adept at participation and simultaneously maintaining their own identity. Contrary to what one author, my former Jewish colleague at the University of Wales, Dan Cohn-Sherbrooke, Jews do not need to be hated to enable them to retain their identity, even though I acknowledge the usefulness of opposition. It is the same with the creation of normal human identity. We quite often define by reference to another, but that negative self-definition is not absolutely essential for our own self-understanding and development. So within this Mediterranean world, Paul founded his communities that were mainly Gentile. To these he directs his advice on how to live the life to which God has called them. The first call is to remain as you were when called. If you were not a Jew, then you must not become one. But if you were, you continue in that pattern since you were called as a Jew. But then Paul elaborates specifically Christian virtues. We use the term outdoor pursuits for strenuous and demanding exercises. Paul tells Christians to pursue love, pursue hospitality, and to pursue peace. These are the things that are specifically markers of the life in Christ. You work to promote love, to promote hospitality, and above all, to promote peace. Paul emphasizes that Christ followers are called to work in a ministry of reconciliation. To be reconcilers or reconciliators is to seek to unite people who are at odds with each other, who see each other as enemies. So Christ followers are called to help reduce enmity, to encourage love, to encourage hospitality, to minister to the needs of the weak and the lost, the confused, and those who are bullied and not accepted. But alongside these specific Christian virtues, Paul surprisingly adds another list. This list is not from within Christian faith, but emanates from Greco-Roman social ideals and society. Thus, Paul does not label these values as specifically Christian, nor does he say anything about their origin. He simply advocates, commends them in the most general and sweeping manner. In the letter to Philippians 4:8, Paul concludes, "Finally, brethren, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is gracious, think about these things." This is a society where Christ's followers are newcomers. They did not create this culture any more than did the Jews. And yet, without any reservations, Paul tells his community at Philippi, anything that is regarded as pure, as honorable, as just, as lovely and gracious, is what you must set your mind upon and live your life by. This indicates not a complete acceptance of everything in Greco-Roman culture, but of anything that is consistent with Christ. It does not have to be commanded in the Bible by Moses or Jesus. It is still worth doing and living by. Here we have clear evidence that Paul himself is not a sectarian, aggressively opposing the rest of the world and its values. Here he incorporates values that are unique to Christianity with those that are compatible with it, and combines the two to produce a pattern of life for Gentiles who never met Jesus or Moses and who are probably only minimally acquainted with contemporary Judaism. This offers us a model for making links and building bridges with those with whom we live who follow differing life patterns or different faiths. If we alienate them or demonize them, we are only encouraging further and greater divisions in our society. But if we can offer this inclusive ethic of Paul, we can emphasize whatever things in Islam or Judaism are lovely, true, or of good report, whichever things are honorable, we can together affirm these values in our diverse society. Values of people who are different, but whose cultural patterns is such that great amounts are shared across the boundaries. Thus, Paul commands his community to emphasize the shared values of their society that are compatible with the Christ movement. And he gives himself as a model to copy. What you have learned and heard and seen in me, put into practice, and the God of peace, that means the God who promotes peace, will be with you. Paul uses an accounting word, the verb logizesthai we have in our logs, to keep an account, to count. And here is where our responsibility becomes clear. If you're doing your bookkeeping, you decide what sort of account you are going to keep. Paul says, keep an account of positive things. Don't be negative and keep a score of other people's failings or where other groups have wronged us. It is possible to think as a sectarian in an us versus them mentality that catalogues all the weakness of others, of Muslims, of black youth, or of Jewish attitudes to this or that. You can not only mentally record all the weaknesses of the other, but you can keep them in mind, dwell on them, and allow your mind to be filled with negative and pessimistic memories. This is not just a matter of choice, as if some people collected sports memorabilia and we keep a catalogue of other people's sins. It is not so simple. What we have in our mind is never passive and never idle. We have seen the advertisement, you are what you eat. It is much worse than that. We are what we have in our minds. We are what we remember. And we are what we permit. And that is quite a serious thing when we look at some of the problems with the war and other issues in the last few years. We in the UK and we in the USA are what we have permitted. Worse still, we are selective normally in that we tend to remember things as they affected us, rather than how they affect the rest of humanity. So even our normal memories may be favorably slanted to our perception of what really happened. How biased then, how jaundiced do we become if we try to remember or tend to remember what is negative, what is only partially true, or what is simply a bundle of lies? The one who thus perverts their view of the other ends in eventually becoming a twisted and perverted person themselves. But we can exercise control of what stays in our minds. We can put some things out of our minds and turn to more positive remembering, and thus purify our own thinking in the process. There is nothing mechanical about our minds. We do have an on-off button about what we can concentrate on, and we need to use it more and more often in our somewhat dishonest or spin-driven society. Here's the test about our attitude to minorities. Are we self-critical in what we record concerning them? And do we use our choice of what to ignore or what to retain concerning them? Do we remember the Crusades and the Holocaust when we see ourselves as victims in a multi-faith society? Do we remember British colonial imperialism in an empire on which the sun never set? What is happening today in Israel and the Arab countries, especially North Africa, owes much to colonialist policies in the last 2 centuries. Those who have read the book, The Great Hunger, on the Irish potato famine beginning in the 1840s, can understand Irish antagonism to English callousness in times of crisis, that depleted and destroyed a whole nation, when this starvation did not have to happen, since there was grain enough and to spare, if only there had been the will to have it distributed. Even in Ulster, English imperialism had caused resentment at an earlier period, when both Presbyterians and Roman Catholics, as united Irishmen, combined to fight the English establishment in an unsuccessful battle in 1798. So Presbyterians and Catholics do have that in common, and that's something that was a good thing to remember in the troubles of the 1960s. Only from 1802 onwards were non-Anglican marriages legally recognized and children recognized as legitimate, partly as a result of this 1798 uprising. This is where Northern Ireland is a strange mixture, part of the UK and very much also part of Ireland as a whole. One of the great virtues of St. Patrick's Day, which is coming up, is that it is a public holiday recognised both in North and South of Ireland by one and all. I'd like now to turn to another example where I want to emphasise that although we have many things in this world over which we have no control, there are issues where we can take charge of our lives despite the failures of the past and take charge of our future by combining together. A few days ago, I received a book review for the Journal of Beliefs and Values, which I've edited for the last 34 years. This book is an expansion of a man called Edward Toby Tirrar, who did a University of California dissertation, doctoral dissertation, and this is an expansion of that dissertation entitled Liberation Theology Along the Potomac, Labor's Golden Rule and Early American Catholicism. The book is a history about the theology of the European settlers in Maryland, and especially about the Catholics in the first half of the 17th century during the period 1640 to 1660, the time of the English Civil War. It chronicles how the working people there formed basic Christian communities. It argues that the working people along the Potomac, and Catholics in particular, established a labour-based society and a resulting theology based on poverty, chastity, and obedience, as they interpreted these, which eventually brought about the abolition of the class system. Through revolutionary conflict, their agrarian, labour, and nationality programs triumphed at the grassroots and at the provincial level over both local capitalism and foreign imperialism. Among the Catholic achievements were an annual parliament, a wide franchise, equal constituencies, taxes that were small or non-existent on food and other necessities, a simplified legal system, no imprisonment for debt, no enclosures, no tithes, and again, no bishops. Maryland Catholics were celebrated for their 1649 law on religious toleration that broadened the separation between church and state. Unlike in New England, where the former English top-down systems tended to be replicated, in Maryland the priority of claim for land went not to the landlord, the proprietor, or rent collector, but to the squatter actually working the land. Even the Jesuits who first complained against these measures were eventually, according to this book, won over by them. And a postscript notes, however, that in the present day, some of the systems the Catholic groups then opposed are now operating to keep down the Muslim working class. Now, I give that as an example of people who were weak and people against whom many evils had been perpetrated prior to this period. And they were struggling for survival and so on. But here we have a group of people who, through their combined work, enabled themselves to have a future and changed the society in which they lived for the good of themselves and for the good of their children. This is where the past and present must meet, and where both victims and perpetrators of evil must acknowledge what has happened. The reconciliation process means facing publicly what has been done and the taking of responsibility for it. South Africa has shown us the way so admirably in this respect. but it is more than attributing and accepting of blame. Even the victims of past evils in the process of reconciliation must take charge of their present lives and their ongoing future, even though they may have had no power, no possibility of being anything except a victim in the past. Now in the reconciliation process, they are again required to be active agents, not passive victims. So the perpetrators of evil and their victims both take charge of their own lives again in reconciliation, so that they can be reconciled as equals, and not just as victims and perpetrators. This is true especially in families, in broken marriages in particular. Even the victim must eventually acknowledge that they are still agents of their own future destiny, however the past has hurt them. To live only in the past and to blame the world for our misery makes us depressed and prevents us moving forward. The purpose of remembering the evils of slavery, the Christian crusades against Muslims, and the Holocaust is not purely historical, nor to depress us with the inhumanity of human beings, but to recognize wrongs that have been done, to learn from this, and then to move forward. One crusade at the end of the 11th century comprised a mixed bunch of adventurers, misfits, and naive idealists. They traveled en route to Jerusalem and stopped at the River Rhine near Heppenheim in South Germany. And there existed there a fine synagogue where one of the best Jewish biblical interpreters had taught. And these so-called crusaders, going to fight the Muslims, murdered all the Jews they could find and then burned their synagogue before continuing to the Holy Land. Facing up to the past, whether as perpetrator of wrongs or as victims in receipt of wrongs, enables a process of healing, of recovery, of transition to begin to take place. Otherwise, we are trapped in an endless cycle or spiral of violence that can destroy both victims and perpetrators. This demands that those with hope for the future, with the strength of their convictions, deny the extremists the public platforms as vehicles for prejudice and half-truths that poison our society and prevent social cohesion and harmony. And nothing could be more relevant than at the present time in this society. This is where the church is acting together, and in conjunction with Jews, with Muslims, and other religious people, have a powerful voice both morally and numerically. So we need to write to our politicians, but also to our church leaders, to call upon them to lead, and not simply to follow where public, uninformed prejudice tends to direct us. This is where evidence is crucial. We are forever indebted to those innumerable people who have given of their wisdom, energy, and devotion to create such fantastic museums as the Holocaust museums in Washington and in Berlin. We can go there to clarify our thinking, to jog our memories, to make us thankful for those who risked their own lives to enable Jews and other threatened people to survive. One of my former Birmingham colleagues is immensely proud of his uncle, who as a doctor in Holland during the Second World War helped many Jews to hide and escape, so much so that a tree has been planted in his honor in the Avenue of Righteous Gentiles in Jerusalem. Last summer, my wife and I spent an afternoon at the Holocaust Museum in Berlin. And we were very impressed by the quality and sophistication of that challenging museum. But we're even more impressed that in Berlin itself, the memories of the Holocaust are not to be found only in the museum, but also on footpaths and in other public buildings, for all to see, for all to learn from and to remember. In this way, it makes clear to us that we are what we remember. In this way, it makes clear to us that positive remembering is not simply for the past, but it is to guide us in the future. We need to take our children at a suitable stage in their lives to places where they can both be informed of the evils of the past, but also enabled to admire those who gave their lives to oppose these evils when the majority failed to act. So we need to learn of the positive contributions of Jews, Muslims, and all others to our society. One of the great tragedies is that when Jews in the 19th century really began to get fully involved in German society, some even giving up Jewish traditions in order to demonstrate their loyalty to the state. Their great gifts and outstanding achievements of some of them were not only not recognized, but became a cause of hatred and of prejudice, of xenophobia. The Jews tried to take on German identity at that period, but were not then accepted. The contribution of gifted people to our society must be fully and generously recognized, whatever their faith or ethnic origin. We can remember that one Asian man tried to enter the Twin Towers in the emergency in order to help, but was prevented from doing so because they were suspicious about what he was up to. We can learn of the contribution of black soldiers in the armed forces long before they were properly appreciated or honored. Last weekend I was in St. Petersburg in Florida, and a friend of mine showed me a war memorial. It had a long list of soldiers listed according to rank, and then at the very bottom two other names appeared, and opposite them it read simply colored. Now that is a former era for which we're thankful, but at the time of the Renaissance, it was the rediscovery of Eastern Islamic scholarship that enabled the Renaissance to bloom and assisted in the rediscovery of Hebrew, leading to the rise of modern science. Islamic culture flourished also in the Middle Ages in Spain, when a great civilization of Muslims, Christians, and Jews temporarily flourished harmoniously together. So it is possible, and it ought to be possible again, for us to live and to enrich each other's lives. We just need the openness and wisdom to know that this will not destroy us or our civilization. So let us be open to learn of the cultural achievements of the other. Let us remember these and celebrate the wonder of the rich world in which we're privileged to live. Instead of being separatist, let us be outgoing and welcoming and accepting, so that the stranger in our midst feels that they belong, that they are not being rejected or despised. Moreover, where our values coincide and the group interests of religious people meet, we can combine with other groups, other religious groups, to oppose those atheists and secularists that view religion itself as an unnecessary evil. And unfortunately for us, religion has inbuilt within it the harvest that can be either good or bad. If we allow prejudice and evil to combine with religion, we will end up with more and more atheists and agnostics who rightly see that this is not a way of life that they want to follow. And it is in our own interests as religious people to so live and so prove our moral worth to our society that people outside us, whether or not they accept our faith, will at least respect for what we do to our society. Any questions? Yep.
Bill, thank you very much, and I want to thank Campbell for this lecture series. I appreciate very much being able to attend many weeks and here. Thanks very much. The concept of reconciliation has a lot of nuances to it. And how do you respond to, say, the work of Mitchell, Mary Mitchell, out of Chicago, that sees reconciliation as a patriarchal homologia, that is, an attempt to get people to stay in their place and to fulfill their responsibility, and that Paul is somehow influenced by this tradition in Roman political theory, or Roman political practice?
I mean, I recognize Margaret Mitchell is a fine scholar, but she differs in her view of Paul from what I think.
And part of the difference is that she is much more embedded in Greco-Roman world, whereas I'm much more embedded in Hebrew background. And that doesn't prove anything. But what I would say is this, that I don't see from Paul's use of the word reconciliation that it is an authoritarian or patriarchal device. As I stressed, the citations that Paul uses, when you compare them carefully, the only other place in the whole of the Bible is Isaiah 65. And the same, in the Greek translation of Isaiah 65, the same sort of sequence and the same words occur, showing that Paul definitely had that passage in mind. Now, of course, as I've said tonight, Paul is influenced by Greco-Roman culture and virtues and so on. He's not immune to that. But what I also said was that the Jews were adept at using the cultural system, living within it, trading within it, flourishing within it, but still retaining their identity. And I think that in words such as this, we need to be careful whether the dictionary definition of classical Greek and Roman thinking is enough, and whether we need to see where Paul's thinking is rooted also in the Hebrew Bible. And I think this may be one of the places. I don't know that particular statement and so on by Margaret Mitchell, but I think that is my response. And my wife has written a book on Paul and power, and in that book she specifically argues that Paul is not a patriarchal follower, that he has nuances in his use of power and his use of Greco-Roman culture that show he differentiates very much from it. He does use things that could refer to patriarchy, but alongside them he talks about being a nurse and images of being a mother as well as a father to his converts. So there's another side, and sometimes, and she would argue, that Paul does this deliberately to show that he's not just following the commonly accepted patterns. But again, this is where scholars differ. But one of the differences is, do you interpret Paul completely out of Hellenism, or do you interpret him out of his Hebrew and Jewish background? Anyone else? Comments as well as questions? Yes?
You mentioned that, like a Christian person in Korea might have a little different Christian than he is in some other part.
Sure. Yep.
And you mentioned that Paul said, keep your Judaism and be Christian and keep your things. Now, I was just wondering if, like in Catholicism, I've heard sometimes that, we have, from the past, there's a lot of paganism brought in. And I was just wondering whether that had something to do with it, like when the time was going on where they allowed the paganism to...
Yep, that's very interesting. Yeah. This is very true in South American Catholicism. And when I was in Selyoke in Birmingham, we had a well-known scholar called Holland, Beggar, who was of Swiss origin, but an expert in Pentecostalism, and had worked with the World Council of Churches in that area. And one of the things that he emphasized was that the South American culture was not a new culture that the church brought, but it was previous cultures combined with aspects of Catholicism and so on, and that this developed into something unique in itself. Now, there is a big question, particularly in some parts of South America, and I'm not an expert to comment on this, but some people would argue how much is Christian and how much is pre-Christian. And of course, the same applies also to Ireland and Wales and other places, that very often you'll find that famous Christian churches are built on previous pagan areas, or previous pagan buildings even, so that there is continuity. And the question is not continuity or discontinuity. What I was trying to say is that none of us start from nothing. We all start somewhere, and that somewhere was not determined by Christianity. It is prior to Christianity. And therefore, in that sense, Christianity is always imbibing prior cultures, and it has to transform them and make them what they should be according to Christian tradition. But I think it's a very interesting question, because what you could say is that I have led you down that route, and here is an example where you might say, some Christians would say that aspects of previous culture were too much imbibed by Christianity. And this is the same with Druidism and so on in Wales, and holy places in Ireland as well. But I think there's no way around it. We are related to previous and other cultures, and we have to then decide what is compatible with Christianity as well as what is not compatible. And one of the strange things about history is that so often Christians just simply claim that Judaism and anything to do with it is incompatible with Christianity. And that is strange, considering that so many other things have been compatible with Christian culture over the centuries. And that really is defining us in opposition to them. It's an us-them sectarian attitude, I think. Anyone else? What about the students? Have I convinced you completely?
I've been to your past 3 lectures, and I do have to say a lot of the things you talked about sparked me.
So I can't hear very well, I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry. A lot of your lectures have sparked me to think about my own Christian identity and my social identity, and the accepting
Yep.
others for who they are, and be more understanding. So it's helped.
It's helped. Good. That's fine. Because you folks are going out into the big wide world, and you need to know who you are and who you're going to be. And some of us wish we'd known a lot earlier what we were and what we were going to be. But it is a much more complicated world than when we were starting out. And you need a lot more resources than we have, or even we have. Yes?
I have a question. I apologize if I missed this in your lecture, but I want to know what you think is the ultimate fate and hope for the future of the minority culture, which many times is oppressed. If you argue that we should not believe, or the minority culture should not believe they can change the dominant culture. You made a reference earlier
Yes.
to someone that pointed out that, and I didn't quite.
I'm not saying they should not change, but what I'm saying is it's less likely that the minority culture will change the majority than the other way around. It's always very difficult for minorities. And one of the big issues, which I didn't mention, is the problem of intermarriage. So, for instance, you get a majority of one kind of people, and our young people will intermarry. And so, because there's more of the majority, there will be more of a drift away from the minority. And the only argument you can have is that young Jewish people should marry Jewish people. And for instance, I had a Korean student who came, and he was 10 years in the UK, and he was finishing his thesis and said he was going to go back home. And I said, what about your children? You told me 2 years ago you were going to take them all with you. He said, it's too late. One's at Cambridge and one's at London University, and they have no intention of ever going back to Korea. And I said, you also told me you would not allow them to marry anyone but a Korean. He said, I haven't even talked about that for the last 2 years. So he was too late in imposing his view. Now, that's not simply a matter for Koreans, but it is a matter where people are a minority. And it's a very serious issue, because it's a drain from the faith. And what some people say, that quotation I gave from my Jewish colleague Dan Cohn-Sherber, he had gathered a number of citations that said Jews need to be hated because it helps them to remain Jews and keeps their young people from joining in the wider society. Now, I don't agree with that. Nobody needs to be hated. But I do think that it is easier when you're not too closely linked with the rest of society to maintain a distance. For instance, in schools, for instance, in Ireland, one group of kids would go home, they'd have fights with the other from Protestant and Catholic schools. And they did that over the generations. And it was also a problem if young people married another person, particularly if the children had to be brought up Catholic. But it did happen. It's always happened. I had an uncle who died in Barrie, Ontario, and I went to see him for the first time, And I was at that time starting to do theology. And he had a touch of humour, so he welcomed me, and he had left Ireland 3 weeks before I was born, so we'd never met. And here at 23, he began to tell me about the family. He says, you may think it's quite impressive that you're going to be a Presbyterian minister, but let me tell you that you're not the first in the Campbell family to go into the church. There's a monk and a nun already in the Campbell family, and I didn't know about them. But they were people of the same district. We don't know what relatives they are, but the same name. They live right beside us, and of course, and what I didn't know was there was a monk and a nun in that family. Now, what that is emphasizing is how people try to remain different to preserve their identity. But even during the Troubles, even during the worst of the fighting and all that, people of the different traditions of Christianity were still getting married. And it's still happening today. So it's not as simple that you can simply keep people apart. But I do think it is a problem for minorities, and a very serious one. So I think that's one of the problems of going to live in another country, far away from your own roots and so on. One of the things that the people in Birmingham have done, and sometimes with very serious results, they bring somebody from Bangladesh to be the husband for some of their daughters. And sometimes, one particular example I have, someone comes not from the cities in Bangladesh, but from the remote countryside. They don't speak English, and they're not educated to the same extent as the woman they're going to marry. And sometimes it is absolute disaster. And the other thing that sometimes has happened, that imams are brought from different parts of the world to places like Birmingham, and have a very different cultural background. And so there's always tension between the local people and the advice these people give about intermarriage and so on. There's no simple, easy solution to these things. But it is very difficult, and it's very difficult particularly for Muslims. One of the sad things is to hear a Muslim father say, I don't want my daughter to marry, don't say marry a Christian, but they say into Western materialism. That's what they're saying. Not Christian, but they don't want Western materialism and everything that goes with it. And I think that's something that we need to think about how Muslims see us, not just how we see them. Any other questions? Otherwise, we can close.
Well, I want to say once again, thank you very much for this successful series.